Okay, so it looks like most of you got in. Thank you again for joining us today. We've had a very large registration for this one, and I really think everyone needs to hear this. So thanks to Juan for arranging it today, and thanks to the doctor for being with us. I myself cannot wait to hear what she has to say. So welcome again, and we're very excited to have this program. I'm Sherry Singer from Singer Communications. I help Association solve their marketing, communications, and public relations challenges. I'm also the founder and one of the co-organizers of Association Xchange, a free virtual lunch and learn program that we hold monthly. If you have a question during this session, please place your questions in the chat box. Juan and I will be moderating the chat box, and we will list your questions and hopefully have them all answered by the end of the session. I'm going to turn it over to Juan so he can introduce our speaker. Wait, I just want to say one more thing. We have a May program set up. Sorry, Juan. We have our May program, which is going to be called the Special Ingredient Project Management for Associations. So I hope you can join us at the end of May for that program. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Juan.
Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate your energy all the time. For those of you who I have not met, I'm Juan Amador, FASAE-CAE at the Association of American Medical Colleges, representing the medical schools, teaching hospitals, and academic societies. And today I have the pleasure of really having Dr. Anish Chagpar here with us to discuss something of importance. Not only throughout the pandemic have we experienced burned out, but prior to that, I think if you're in the association industry, you can empathize with me that many of you sometimes at some point have felt this. Most recently, ASAE did an entire collection on associations now, focusing on burnout. And throughout the chat, I will be sharing some of these resources with you. So I will also place Dr. Anish Chagpar's introduction, but I wanted to take the opportunity to just briefly highlight her background. Dr. Anish Chagpar is a professor in the Department of Surgery at Yale School of Medicine. She's a graduate at the University of Alberta and the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. She completed her Susan G. Komen Interdisciplinary Breast Fellowship from the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. She holds a Master of Public Health from Harvard School of Public Health. She also has a master's in bioethics and medical humanities from the University of Louisville. Most recently, she completed her MBA for executives with a focus on leadership in healthcare at Yale's School of Management. She holds and is very active in participating in many associations and various advisory boards with the fostering and her goal of continuing to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in healthcare. On a personal note, I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Anish Chagpar, and I welcome her today. Thank you, Anish, for being here. I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Juan, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So without too much further ado, let me share my screen. All right, so the topic that I was given today was burnout or burn bright. And I added the on the end because it is possible for us not only to continue to thrive despite burnout and in spite of burnout, but potentially even burn brighter and develop resilience so that we can overcome burnout and potentially make ourselves even better on the other side. So as Juan mentioned, many of us had suffered with burnout even prior to the pandemic. In fact, it was in 2018 that the World Health Organization developed this definition of burnout and characterized it as a chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, characterized by three dimensions. So feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. It referred specifically to a phenomenon in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life, although certainly we can have stresses in other areas of life that can compound this. But this is how the World Health Organization incorporated burnout into its international classification of diseases. So this was back in 2018, and you can see here, as Juan mentioned, much of my work happens in the medical space, and we've heard a lot about burnout in the medical space for quite some time. This was a meta-analysis of over 180 studies involving over 100,000 individuals from 45 countries from 1991 to 2018. So well before we had ever heard of COVID-19. And even back then, the overall rate of burnout was 34%. There was a survey that was done by the Massachusetts General Physicians Organization that tracked burnout and looked at burnout rates and the trends from 2014 to 2017. And they found that it was increasing over this period, again, pre-pandemic. Well, the pandemic also threw a wrench in things. So this is a data from Medscape, again, looking at physicians. But you can see that the majority of people, nearly 80%, stated that their burnout really started before the COVID-19 pandemic and has really affected their workplace happiness. So you can see pre-pandemic, about 69% said that they were happy. Post-pandemic, 49%. Now, while these data relate to physicians, I would argue that for all of you who are executives and professionals in the association space, you're at risk too. So every year, or every few years, CareerCast puts out a list of the 10 most stressful jobs. And this is their most recent list. This is from 2019, so just pre-pandemic. And you can see the list here: enlisted military personnel, firefighters, airline pilots, police officers, broadcasters, event coordinators, news reporters, public relations executives, senior corporate executives. And when we think about your role, I would argue that many of you may fall into these categories, whether you're labeled as such or not. And you can see here the factors that went into determining how stressful these careers were. So travel, growth potential, physical demands, environmental conditions, hazards, meeting public, competitiveness, putting your own life at risk or being in charge of the life of another, having deadlines, working in the public eye, and certainly some of these are relevant to you as well. So many of you may feel a little like this, just a little stressed, and may warn people to just turn around and leave quietly so that no one gets hurt. Now, the thing is that everybody needs a little bit of stress. We know from the Yerkes-Dodson law that stress actually can improve performance. So as we have more stress, we get increasing attention and interest until we have optimal arousal and optimal performance. But beyond that, when we start getting more stress, that's when things start going downhill. And so for many of us who may feel the effects of burnout, we're really on this end of the curve. So why do we care? Well, the American Psychiatric Association in 2019, so again, pre-pandemic, found that about 61% of workplace employees suffered from workplace stress. And we care because that has significant ramifications, both in terms of physical and emotional tools, as well as the economic cost of burnout. So in terms of physical ramifications, we know that you can have neck and back pain, difficulty sleeping, which can lead to fatigue, headaches. Ultimately, all of this can lead to absenteeism, depression, and even suicide. When we think about the economic costs, there is, of course, the associated healthcare costs, which are estimated to be around $190 billion, that's with a B, annually. And if we add in things like turnover and low productivity, we get up to 322 billion. And we all know that the pandemic has certainly caused added turnover with the Great Resignation, and we'll get into that in a minute as well. So when we think about burnout and its etiologic factors, we think about things like a lack of rest, a lack of agency, being able to determine your own way of doing things, having autonomy over your life, a lack of community and social connections, and a lack of purpose, not feeling fully engaged in one's work. Well, certainly the pandemic caused us all to have a lack of rest as we took on more and more work, right? Certainly in the healthcare space, we took on more occupational work. But even outside of this, all of us took on more work as schools were closed and we had to take care of loved ones at home. We had to do more cooking at home when restaurants were closed. Many of us felt a lack of agency. We didn't have control over this pandemic. There was a virus that was in charge, and there was a lack of community. Social connections were really limited as we tried to distance from each other. And while one can argue that we had purpose as we were trying to get through this all together, it really did increase our burnout. Add to that a little bit of time to think about what's important in life and how much time are we getting to spend with our kids and our families. What really is important? What might be the next great pandemic? Are we really truly satisfied in our jobs? Couple that with a lack of resources as we entered an era of economic downturn, and we get the Great Resignation. So how can we really get around that? Well, the first thing is to evaluate how burned out we are. So I have a little self-evaluation I hope all of you will participate in. So I'm going to read you 15 phrases or sentences, and I want you to just grab a piece of paper and write down how many points you would score on each of the following 15 statements. So give yourself 1 point if this is not at all applicable to you, 2 points if it's rarely applicable, 3 points for sometimes, 4 points for often, and 5 points for very often. Okay, everybody ready? Here we go. First, I feel run down and drained of physical or emotional energy. I have negative thoughts about my job. I am harder and less sympathetic with people than perhaps they deserve. I am easily irritated by small problems or by my coworkers and team. I feel misunderstood and underappreciated by my coworkers. I feel that I have no one to talk to. I feel that I am achieving less than I should. I feel under an unpleasant level of pressure to succeed. I feel that I am not getting what I want out of my job. I feel that I am in the wrong organization or the wrong profession. I am frustrated with parts of my job. I feel that organizational politics or bureaucracy frustrate my ability to do a good job. I feel that there is more work to do than I practically have the ability to do. I feel that I do not have the time to do many of the things that are important to doing a good quality job. I find that I do not have time to plan as much as I would like to. Okay, those were the 15 sentences. So by now, you should have 15 numbers on a piece of paper. So quickly go down the list and add them up. How did you do? So here's how you can interpret your score. For those of you lucky enough to have a score between 15 and 18, congratulations. No signs of burnout here. Even if you got 19 to 32, there's a little sign of burnout, unless some factors are particularly severe. But for many of us, I think that many of us might be in the higher categories. I know I am. So 33 to 49, be careful. You may be at risk of burnout, particularly if several of the scores were high. For 50 to 59, you're at severe risk of burnout, and you need to do something about that. And 60 to 75, you are at very severe risk of burnout, and you need to do something about this urgently. So then the question is, great, but what do I do? Well, there have been a number of studies that have looked at resilience as a means of kind of getting over some burnout. The simplest score is something called the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale. It only has 2 criteria. So it's scored from 0 to 4, from 0 being not true at all, 1 being rarely true, 2 sometimes true, 3 often true, and 4 always true. So you give yourself a score from 0 to 4 for each of the following 2 statements. I'm able to adapt when changes occur, and I tend to bounce back after illness, injury, or other hardships. So now you have a resilience scale, and you can see here, this was an analysis of again, trainees, medical trainees, physicians. They looked at 1,350 physicians, and they found that 29% hit that 8. So pretty resilient, but 82% were down here in the 0 to 3 category. And what they found was that on multivariable analysis, when they adjusted for sex, age, hours worked, practice settings, specialties, for each 1 point increase in that resilience score, you had a 36% lower odds of burnout. So trying to develop this ability to be resilient, to bounce back, to adapt, really helps us in terms of burnout. But it's not like we can simply go to the local drugstore and say, can we please have an ounce of resilience? It doesn't quite work that way. But fortunately, the American Psychological Association has a great toolkit that can help us to build individual resilience. And it's really based on a number of key areas. So the first is building connections, prioritizing relationships, joining groups, thinking about how we can come together. And particularly for all of you being executives and professionals working in associations, this should give you a lot of meaning to the work that you do, because that is part of what associations provide. The second is finding purpose. So having an outlet to help others, to be proactive, moving towards our goals and looking for opportunities for self-discovery. When we start with our why, so everybody may be familiar with this book by Simon Sinek, where he talked about really understanding your personal purpose, your values, your mission. That can be very helpful. And in fact, there have been studies that looked at this, that having an affirmation of your personal values actually buffers your neuroendocrine and psychological stress response. So we can see this biologically as well. Many people actually focus on this quadrant when we think about how we can overcome burnout and foster resilience. This idea of wellness, taking care of your body, practicing mindfulness, and avoiding negative outlets. Certainly, many of us feel between work and home that our internal battery gets depleted. And we know that we can, plug that battery in, but it does take a few things. So whether it's meditation or exercise or taking time to foster relationships, participating in hobbies, leisure travel, faith, all of these things, depending on the individual, can refuel that internal battery and give you the energy that you need to take care of all of the other things that we do in our day-to-day life, because these things aren't going away. We know that physical activity and meditation, both of these have been found to increase neurotransmitters like galanin, increase angiogenesis and neurogenesis, reduce neuroinflammation and oxidative stress. All of this is medical speak for the fact that it leads us to be happier, reduces stress, and reduces depression. Oh, and it's also good for your brain. Now, some people think that it might be good just to, take a chance and just scream every once in a while, get it out of you. But actually, the data suggests that that's a fallacy. Alternate strategies may be more helpful. So take a few deep breaths, go for a walk, reframe thoughts. So the next time you get cut off in traffic, instead of thinking, what an reframe it. Maybe they're in a really big hurry because, somebody is expecting a baby and delivering in the car and they really need to get to the hospital ASAP. You never know. Don't ruminate. So many of us get ourselves into this cycle of thinking about all of the things that we're stressed out about and continuing to ruminate. You want to distract yourself, or if you need to ruminate or think about things, some people would argue to set a timer. 15 minutes is my rumination limit. I'm going to worry about things for 15 minutes, and then when the clock goes off, that's it. I'm moving on to other things. Easier said than done, in my personal opinion. Completing small tasks is often helpful, kind of giving us a sense of fulfillment and accomplishment, and helping others in need. It's remarkable how helping someone else can really do wonders to helping ourselves. And the final quadrant here is embracing healthy thoughts. Keeping things in perspective. This pandemic is not going to last forever. In fact, I saw today on the news that Dr. Fauci actually thinks that we're getting out of the pandemic phase of this pandemic. Accepting change as a part of life, maintaining a hopeful outlook, and learning from our past. So as Nietzsche said, there will always be rocks in the road. The question about whether these are stumbling blocks or stepping stones, that really depends on our perspective. So, when we think about the rough road ahead, it really depends on how we kind of move with that. And these are not unique to our own situation. So think about J.K. Rowling. She had the Harry Potter script. She sent it around to a dozen publishing houses before somebody accepted it. Steve Jobs got forced out of the company that he started at the age of 30. Walt Disney was fired from the Kansas City Star because he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. And Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team. Jim Carrey was booed off the stage at a comedy club, failed to land a part on Saturday Night Live. Oprah Winfrey was fired from a local TV station because the producer felt that she was unfit for television. The Beatles were rejected from a recording studio who didn't like their sound and felt that they had no future in show business. And Albert Einstein wasn't able to speak until the age of 4, and his teachers thought that he would never amount to much. So there are bumps in the road for everybody, but as all of these examples show you, you can get past this and do it in great style. Now, of course, when all else fails, it's important to seek help. And I hope that there are a number of resources that you have in your organizations and associations for people to seek help with mental health. And certainly your doctor and other health professionals can help there as well. The other thing I wanted to take just a minute to talk about was moving beyond individual resilience to think about institutional resilience. How can we as organizations, as associations, as institutions become more resilient? Because the truth be told, we all took a beating from this pandemic, and we all needed to kind of bounce back. So the OECD classifies institutional resilience as comprising the capacity to deliver and enhance results over time, credibly, legitimately, and adaptively, as well as the ability to manage shocks and change. Sounds a lot like what we just talked about in terms of individual resilience. But you can see here that as we increase resilience, we get to this transforming bubble where we actually can not only just, support resilient actions and behaviors, withstand shocks and change as a reflection of that, but that we can actually unlock suppressed economic and social potential, potentially being even better than we were before. And I think we can use the same framework. So think about building connections, collaboration, teamwork, having a diverse workforce that really helps each other. When we think about quality improvement, we think about the Swiss cheese approach. And so having people work together, especially when they come from diverse backgrounds, can often mitigate against that, providing new and innovative ideas. This can foster finding purpose and being true to institutional mission and values, and having a continual learning environment where we go through plan, do, study, act cycles to become even better. Certainly having a culture of mutual support can foster wellness. And I think through this pandemic, many organizations started to really recognize opportunities. How can we flex? How can we learn from past mistakes, situate ourselves in a way that we can really learn from best practices and potentially even grow as an organization? A lot of this has to do with leadership. And so in all of your roles, think about that in terms of institutional responsibility. How do you engage people? How do you recognize great work? Do you have people working to their strengths? Do you ensure work-life balance? Are expectations clear? Is the environment one that is transparent and fair? And perhaps equally importantly, is it fun? So, Jim Collins, one of the great authors who wrote Good to Great, talks about this hedgehog concept, which speaks to strengths-based leadership, right? Focusing on what you do well and what energizes you. Jim Collins talks about the hedgehog being at the nexus of what you care deeply and passionately about, what you can be the best in the world at, and what drives your economic engine. And I think that during the pandemic, as many of us have reflected on this, both as individuals and as institutions, we've begun to see that hedgehog and to develop where we are individually and as institutions. And at the same time, while we focus on our strengths, we need to manage our weaknesses. What drains us, even if we're good at it? And so when we think about that, that's where really building this diverse collaboration of teammates can really add to a strengths-based organization. There was a study that was done in 2007 where they found that employees who felt that they had the opportunity to do what they did best were less likely to have a turnover, 50% lower turnover, 38% more likely to have protective units, 44% more likely to have higher customer satisfaction. And only a third of the 10 million employees surveyed said that they had the opportunity to do what they did best every day. And it's really that sense of having agency over what you do every day that can lead to lower rates of burnout. So in summary, we know that burnout exists. We've talked about its etiologic factors. We've talked about its effects, both on an individual front as well as on an institutional one. But we know that we can burn bright and potentially even brighter as we build individual and institutional resilience. So I'll stop there and thank you so much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Anise, for that. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise. And just to let everyone know, we are recording this and we are going to make this live in a couple of days. So Anise, if we have a couple of questions for you, starting with, is there a correlation with burnout as it relates to your age, your socioeconomic status, where you live at in terms of your geography area?
Yeah, so the truth is that everybody, every sociodemographic group can suffer from burnout. But when you think about these other things that you mentioned, so your age, your socioeconomic status, where you live, those things can pile on stress as well, right? So if you are in a lower socioeconomic status and it's really difficult to even make ends meet, and then you're suffering with burnout at work, that only compounds things. Similarly, if you are, working in a rural community and having even more difficulty with transportation and getting into work, having less flexibility and so on and so forth, that all is compounding. But there is no group that you can point to, the most affluent, the whitest, the richest, the most urban, that doesn't have some burnout.
Our follow-up, you referenced the exercise that you asked about 15 questions, and one of my colleagues was asking, is there a way to find that as a resource? Are you able to share those questions with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have the link with me at the moment, but I'm happy to send you the link later, and I can get that to you.
Right.
And this is being recorded, so you'll have them there as well.
Good. You started to talk about institutional resilience, and in some of my colleagues' organizations, they're feeling that there may not be support or there isn't support. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and how, as the association's executive, whether you're the executive director or the senior director or someone in the position that can influence change, how can we address that to help our colleagues?
Yeah. So I think, you know, being in a position to influence change is a great thing. And so I think the easiest way to go about it is to, you know, talk to the organization and first of all, identify the issue. So if people don't feel that their organizations are embracing the concept of institutional resilience and workplace wellness and so on and so forth, oftentimes they need to see things through a different lens. So perhaps the lens is an economic lens. How are we doing economically? What's our bottom line? Oftentimes that's what CEOs and CFOs are interested in. And when you can show them the economic impact of turnover, absenteeism, healthcare costs, low employee engagement, oftentimes they will be interested in building a more resilient culture. And then I think the next thing to do is to engage your colleagues. You know, how can we build an infrastructure that is more engaging and that does foster wellness and resilience? And then if you really wanted to be academic about it, measure the impact of what you do and be able to present the results to the C-suite. By seeing the improvements in employee engagement and economic returns, they're more likely to buy into that as permanent change.
Sherry, you have a couple of questions.
I took a couple of the comments and turned them into questions because I thought they were really good and that they would benefit the community as a whole. So here's one that I actually even have for myself, and that is how they were specifically talking about their sort of part-time to full-time, but it's work creep and they wind up being more full-time. So how do we set limits or boundaries with our employers?
I think good communication is always critical, right? So I would just say, you know what, these are my hours and I'm going to be off these hours. These are the days that I work. These are the days that I don't work. And I think part of it is that so many of us are so committed that the email is always on, the phone is always on, and we find it difficult to separate from work. And I think that that just takes some self-discipline. Mm-hmm. But I also think that it's a matter of prioritization. So, you know, many of us, me, for example, I am driven by my calendar. I actually block the time on the calendar. This is gym time. This is meditation time. This is family time. And I stick to it like it's an appointment, just like I would stick to an appointment at work.
So our numbers as an industry were really high. Like most people, I don't know if you saw the numbers when they came in, but most people were like 40s, 50s, even a few people in the 60s, meaning that as an industry, there's a lot of burnout. Do you have any suggestions on the way the association industry might start to work on, you know, lowering those numbers as a full industry rather than individual by individual?
Yeah, so I think that you've got a wonderful megaphone as an association, right? To really highlight this as an issue and provide resources for people who and organizations that want to, you know, implement some changes in their workforce. I think that having a session like this is a good first step. And then it's a matter of really thinking about what's going to work for your particular organization. And for every organization, that's going to be slightly different in terms of their workplace culture and their goals. But I think by and large, getting the community of people to all agree that this is important and that we want to build a culture that is nourishing and rejuvenating rather than depressing and disengaging. is the first step. And then once you have that buy-in, thinking about the appropriate strategies that will work in that particular workplace will come.
There was also, I'll ask you one last question. There was a lot of sort of chatter about people are not necessarily afraid to make themselves vulnerable with admitting that they're burned out or they have some mental health stresses going on, but that there's still a stigma around mental health for many, especially in a professional environment.
Yeah.
And do you have any suggestions? I know you talked about institutional resilience, and I feel like everyone is experiencing this and, you know, don't know the exact right way to go to your employer without looking like I can't do my job. And that there's a stigma around the mental health aspect of burnout.
You know, that is not just an institutional issue, that is a societal issue. That there just has been this stigma, I think, and that's a much bigger issue, right? Because we as a society need to accept the fact that just like you can, you know, call in sick because you get a terrible flu or, you know, you have another physical ailment. You know, mental health is real. And I think that we're beginning as a society to realize this and to realize the impact that it has. When Simone Biles, one of the greatest gymnasts of all time, says, you know what, I'm not going to compete for that gold medal because I am burned out. I have too much stress at the moment. And I think that she got great applause for having the guts to say that. So I think that on an institutional or an organizational level, I think it behooves the leadership to embrace that and to say, it's okay. If you need, you know, a mental health day, you need to take some time off to kind of take a breath and recoup. That's okay. On the individual side, if you are feeling like, geez, I don't know that I can do that. I don't know that I can go to my senior leadership and ask for a day off. Do this. Say that you need to go to the doctor. And it's true, you do, right? And go and get help, right? Take some time, even if it's PTO. Take the time to do your own thing, or tell your boss, listen, I'm going to take the rest of this afternoon off. I will make up the time whenever you're going to make up the time. Most are going to be relatively flexible with that. Even if you don't want to tell them why you're taking that time off, it's important for you to look after yourself first, because number one, you're not going to be able to do your job if you don't take care of yourself. It's kind of the oxygen mask phenomenon, right? And number two, you're worth it. And number three, if you don't do that, you're going to quit.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's better to take the half day off than be off forever and ever.
Well, I just want to say this was a fantastic program. Thank you again, Juan, and thank you, Dr. Chagpar, and we really appreciate your insight into this issue. Please join us in May for our program on project management for associations. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Anise.
Bye.
Thanks again.